All right. Good morning again, everybody. I got just a couple minutes after 11. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm David Cobb. I appreciate everybody being here this morning. The presentation I'm going to give today is about science and the Wildlife Commission. And there's been a number of inquiries over the last year or so, especially since the research director position was created and the agency-wide research committee was formed and that kind of thing. There's been a lot of discussion amongst all the different divisions and lots of questions. So I thought maybe this would be a good opportunity to present some information and hopefully get some conversation going. So I'm going to start out sort of 30,000 feet and try to drill in. And I'm going to start with this model I call the operational arc of natural resource conservation. And I'll make the argument that everything we do in our agency, no matter who you are, what position you're in, or where you work, operates under this operational arc. And so there's four elements to this. One's biology, one's sociology, one's economics, and one's politics. So in my view, everything has these four elements. You just have to identify what they are and dig down into the details. But you can separate them into technical aspects, the biology, which is a lot of what I and some of the other folks in the agency have dealt with for years. And it's pretty technical. It stays the same a lot. There's a lot of details about individual species that don't change much and that kind of thing. But all this other stuff, all this sociology, economics, and politics is all highly adaptive. In other words, it changes. It may change from one day to the next. Sometimes it changes within the same day. And then you can wrap all of those adaptive elements, the sociology, economics, and politics up into cultural aspects. All those things are influenced by our culture. And it's not only the culture where we work, it's the culture where we live, and in a lot of cases, the culture where we came from. And then you can sort of wrap that whole thing together in what I call a historical context, because history matters. History matters in what we do as employees of the agency. It matters in what we do as an agency. And it also has an influence on our perspective based on our historical context. So if you look at what we do from that perspective and look at it from the perspective of trying to balance the biology, sociology, economics, and politics, what I call optimizing the relationship between those four, and doing those in that cultural and historical context, it not only, at least for me, helps me understand things a whole lot better, but also helps figure out how to resolve some of the questions and some of the challenges that we have. So again, starting from 30,000 feet, because science in the Wildlife Commission permeates from the bottom to the top and all angles in between, I wanted to start with our commission. We have a 19-member commission, and this is a photograph of our current commission. We have most commissioners appointed by the governor. There's 9 district commissioners, and all 9 of these district commissioners work on 6-year staggered terms. And so districts 1, 4, and 7 work on the same schedule. Districts 2, 5, and 8 work on the same schedule. And then districts 3, 6, and 9 work on the same schedule. And they're alternated, and that's based on the original establishment legislation for the commission, so that all of these commissioners are not replaced at the same time. The governor then gets 2 at-large appointees, and the at-large appointees from the governor operate on 4-year terms. Then the Speaker of the House gets 4 appointments. They're all on 2-year terms. And the President Pro Tem of the Senate gets 4 appointments, and they're all on 2-year terms. The point here, well, there's a lot of points here, but some of the points here is that we do have a large board. We have a large commission, 19 commissioners compared to other agencies across the country. Is a large policy board. There's turnover if not every year, turnover every couple of years. That's by design to provide for connectivity and longevity and some of these things. But it does operate pretty well. The commission is divided into a whole series of committees, and the various division chiefs or executive staff are the contacts for those committees. And ultimately, the commission sets the policy for the agency, and the policies include policies related to science. So there's always lots of questions and interest in where we get our money. And I was originally asked this question from a research perspective by some of the folks over at OSBM. So you really can lump our funding sources into three different categories. So the first is federal assistance, which most of the folks in the divisions that are doing, field research are accustomed to. We have the wildlife and sport fish restoration, and that includes PR funds, the Pittman Robertson funds and Dingell Johnson funds, the state and tribal wildlife grants, and then we get Section 6 endangered species grants. And they're from three different agencies, either the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or the National Marine Fisheries Service. Those federal assistance funds are matched in one way or another by state funds, and we also have sources of state funds that we can use just straight out in and of themselves for research funding. And those state funds can come from the Wildlife Commission license revenue, the Wildlife Endowment Funds, or the Non-Game Aquatic Species Fund. And we get a portion of that fund balance. That's a fund that is administered in conjunction with DOT and addresses some of these non-game aquatic issues, especially related to DOT projects. And then we get all kinds of extramural funds. Examples include National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funds, all kinds of private companies. I've just listed two here, Dominion Power and Duke Energy. We work a lot with non-governmental organizations, and again, I've only listed two here, Trout Unlimited and the National Wild Turkey Federation. And then, of course, we get extramural funds from universities and other cooperators in the form of match. So, for example, if we're doing a project with a university using Pittman Robertson funds, that requires a 25% match. And so what we'll end up doing is providing Pittman Robertson funding through the agency and using the university funds or university options for the cooperator match. And that's how we'll fund the project. One of the points here is we have a lot of sources of research money. It comes from a lot of different places. There are a number of different requirements on those funds, but it allows us to do a very broad suite of survey, monitoring, and research activities. And those activities are really housed in 5 different divisions. So one is wildlife management. A second is inland fisheries. We've got research in HABCON, the Habitat Conservation Division, the Land and Water Access Division, and the Office of Conservation Policy and Analysis. And what I wanted to do just to make the point of how broad our survey, monitoring, and research interests are is to go through some examples of these. And I will point out before I start using these examples that as everybody that's on here from our agency knows, we are operating still under a series of research protocols and guidelines related to COVID. And certainly all of our field staff follow those. Many of the pictures you'll see, you won't see masks and those kind of things, but obviously these pictures were taken back before COVID was even an issue. But we certainly do follow not only research protocols from a research perspective, but also from a safety perspective. I'm going to break this in really sort of two pieces. One's biological science research, and the other is going to be social science research, because they're both very important aspects of what our agency does. We've got a lot of staff in our agency that are involved in both of these. And so I want to make sure to point out that we have a very broad interest in both biological and social science. And it ranges, again, these are just going to be a lot of different examples, but things like migratory game birds, bats in this case. We do a lot of work in our agency on bats, including things like monitoring white nose syndrome and other diseases. Projects include state-specific projects like surveys of various aquatic species, to examples like the dove nesting project. We're one agency in the country that contributes to the Continental Dove Monitoring Program. And so we have staff across the agency, mostly in the various depots that have for many years trapped and banded mourning doves. Things like monitoring projects for golden eagles using camera traps and deer carcasses, and a lot of work on the coast. One of the really interesting parts about being here in North Carolina is because we go from the ocean to the high mountains, at least high for the east. We have such a diversity of wildlife and habitats, and such a diverse staff. We get into a lot of different species. All kinds of songbirds, both rare and common. Game birds like wild turkeys, and I'll talk a little bit more about a large turkey research project that the Wildlife Management Division is doing here in a few minutes. Into all kinds of mammals, both common and uncommon mammals, and new things always crop up. Like, for example, the new rabbit hemorrhagic disease that has the potential to become a real issue here, as it has in some other places. We're working now with wildlife management and the folks over at NC State to put together a very large deer project, which will be one of the first ones we've done in a long time. Things like Carolina northern flying squirrels, federally listed species that our wildlife diversity staff's been working on for many years. And then, of course, common species, or at least common now, like black bears and others. And then lots of herps and non-game species. And again, this spans all the way from the coast to the mountains, and in many cases is delving into not only in some cases common species, but in many cases rare species that are either listed or being proposed for listing. And so one of the really important parts of these projects on these rare or at least uncommon species is trying to gather enough information so that hopefully we can keep many of these species from being federally listed. Things like elk, of course, we now have elk in North Carolina, and so we have wildlife management staff that's been working on elk for many years, and everything from monitoring to we currently have a research project looking at population estimation of elk. And then, of course, we get into lots of aquatic work, lots of habitat work. The habitat work done by all the different field divisions is extremely important, and that ranges from everything from corridors to the use of fire. I argue fire is our friend. If you're wanting to manage habitats, one of the biggest bangs for your buck can be using a drip torch. I also argue that there's lots of biologists that have a pyromaniac gene. So we do have projects looking at the impacts of fire. One of those right now is through HabCon. And then lots of projects in the fisheries world and the aquatic world. not only looking at habitat issues and water quality issues, but survey and monitoring projects. And I'm not going to comment on any of the people in any of these photographs. I'm going to let y'all just check that out. But one of the cool things to me about the breadth of these projects is they can go all the way from backpack electroshock and monitoring type projects way up in the mountains to very large projects down the coast using very large boat shocking rigs, and the work ranges all the way from monitoring projects to research projects looking at population dynamics, looking at genetic issues related to different species, and everything in between. In addition, we have the Conservation Aquaculture Center in Marion, which is part of the Marion Hatchery. And over the years, there's been a lot of different projects done, especially with very rare species. There's been life history studies on over 25 freshwater mussel species done at the center. And there's been 3 species just in the last few years that have been reintroduced because of research work done up there in stream segments where they've been absent for at least 100 years. So again, the taxa that our staff work on are varied and range all the way from very large charismatic mammals and birds to invertebrates and everything in between. In the fisheries world, again, we've got projects that go from the mountains to the coast, and some of these include population survey work, status work. A lot of it also now includes genetics. For example, over the years, there's been a lot of brook trout genetics work done, looking not only at the composition of the brook trout populations that we have in North Carolina, but how they relate to different watersheds and different places in other states. And so there's a lot of new, or at least for me, new technology and new approaches that continuously come online. I think one of those that we're really getting into now is a lot of the genetics work, and I think there's a really bright future for using that work. I mentioned earlier the project evaluating the impacts of prescribed fire. This is on pollinators, and this is a project being done in the Habitat Conservation Division. And for a lot of years, our agency really didn't do any work per se on pollinators. We did lots and lots of habitat work that impacted a lot of pollinators, but not a whole lot of actual research projects on pollinators. So that certainly has changed. Okay, so let's talk about the social science research for a little bit. Human dimension stuff. You know, it is, in my view, as important as the biological science work is, because somebody once said that wildlife managers are only allowed to do what the public lets them do. And so not only is understanding our public really important, but helping them understand us and what we do is equally important. And that ranges all the way from just understanding what different user groups are and what their perspectives are, to preferences that various types of hunters and fishermen and boaters and trappers and groups that engage in the outdoors, what their interests are, to things like resolving wildlife conflicts. So what I wanted to do is just give you a few very specific examples of some projects that have been done in the different divisions, and what these projects are designed or were designed to do, and what the results are benefiting. So let's talk about genetics first. So I'll use a black bass genetics project first. So in this project, They've looked at the genotypes for largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass, Alabama bass in the reservoirs and rivers across the state. And the translocation of black bass by anglers is occurring across North Carolina, and Alabama bass is a big concern. So they're really trying to get baseline genetics to look at hybridization and prioritizing what some of the management objectives need to be. Another is genetic marker and diversity analysis for mussels. So based on this project, high throughput and low cost genotype and protocol for each species will be developed. And then the results will contribute to implementing a comprehensive monitoring program and a restoration effort for priority mussel species. A big project in the mountains in the fisheries division is looking at muskie habitat use, population characteristics, and stocking on the French Broad. And so staff are quantifying pool habitats and woody debris availability, looking at the use of restored floodplain sloughs by juvenile and adults, and determining the age, structure, growth, and condition of fish collected in the upper French Broad. So they're really doing this research project to evaluate the stocking and habitat restoration efforts that have been put in place up there that are really innovative and will inform future management decisions. So a couple or three human dimensions projects that I'll mention is the 2020 Public Mountain Troutwater Angler Survey. And so this project was designed to inform the inland fisheries folks in their decision to combine the two catch and release trout classifications. And through the project, they also identified dissension points and methods to reduce conflict between different angling groups. There was a Sunday hunting on game lands project in 2019 and 20. And as most folks in the agency have heard, certainly there's a lot of discussion for a number of years now about hunting on Sunday, both on private land and on game lands. But one of the real game land issues is the potential conflicts between user groups, because some of our game lands do have a lot of use by a lot of different folks. So the project required the establishment of a multi-criteria decision-making model based on the concerns of the different user groups, as well as the input from the game land staff, and inform changes to the game land management that allow Sunday hunting on certain properties. And one example of the use of this work is at the most recent commission meeting, the Land and Water Access staff recommended and the commission approved opening Sunday hunting on a series of game lands across the state. And then a third project is identifying the wildlife recreation barriers of the disability community. That was another project in 2019 and 20. Certainly the agency is always looking to provide more opportunities for recreationists. And in this case, this particular project was aimed at identifying ways of increasing access for the disability community. So the community was included in these discussions, and part of that was not only identifying potential barriers, but working on solutions to improve the opportunities and the experiences of all wildlife recreationists with disabilities. And then I'm just going to hit on three more here. One is, all three of these are in Land and Water Access. One is the Forest Optimization Project. And this project is really to develop a strategic forest management plan that maximizes annual cash flow while maintaining quality wildlife habitat. Because one of the really unique things about how our Land and Water Access staff manage the game lands is they're always managing for wildlife habitat first. And so this is a project to look at how to optimize that goal of quality wildlife habitat with other possible goals for managing the property. A second project is the economic impact evaluation of game lands. We've had these kind of evaluations for other things in the agency, and certainly game lands at about 2.1 million acres or so, and about 500 to 600,000 allocated to the commission. They're of high interest to the public. So this project was to assess game land use by different user groups and look at economic contributions relative to recreation and non-market values. So there's a lot of interest in really looking at the economic benefits of having a game land in a particular county or a particular area. And then the last one I'll hit on, and it's a really cool project that's a collaboration, is the Angola Bay Hydrologic Restoration Project. And it's cooperative with the Nature Conservancy and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to complete 7,500 acres of hydrologic restoration on Angola Bay. And the goals and the outcomes of the project would be to reduce downstream flood pulse magnitudes, mitigate soil loss, improve tree growth, and improve Poquoson wildlife habitat values. And then also to try to allow for opportunities for prescribed fire. So again, those are just some examples from 3 different areas within the agency, but certainly, as you can see, our staff are involved in a lot of very diverse work. And the way I really categorize this is it's a balance between 3 areas. One is, there's fisheries and wildlife resources across the state. There's aquatic and terrestrial habitats across the state, and there's people. And so what we really try to do as an agency, and this really does, in my view, span from our field staff all the way to our commission, our administrative staff, everybody that's in this agency, no matter what we do, is we try to hit this spot in the middle. We try to hit the spot where the fisheries and wildlife resources overlaps with the aquatic and terrestrial habitats and overlaps with people. It's not always a really easy thing to do. Jack Ward-Thomas, and anybody who doesn't know who Jack Ward-Thomas is, please go look him up when this is done. He was the chief of the USDA Forest Service, but there's lots more to know about him. He was the only wildlife biologist to ever be the chief of the USDA Forest Service. But once upon a time, he said, incorporating science into policy is not really science, it's an art. And this is not for the timid. And just for the record, I will point out that this is a photograph of an actual public hearing. Right now, I can't see who all's on the call, but there should be some folks there that would certainly remember it. I will promise you I certainly did, because this was a room full of folks that didn't particularly like what they heard or thought they were going to hear. And if you learn nothing else from this, you can learn that if you want to fill up a room, tell a bunch of folks we're going to eliminate hunting deer with dogs, and they'll turn out in force. All right, so I mentioned earlier that we do a lot of cooperative research, and I'm just going to touch on one project just because it's a current project in the Wildlife Management Division, and it's certainly one of the largest projects we've got going on right now. It's entitled Multi-Scale Assessment of Wild Turkey Ecology in North Carolina, and it's collaborative among our agency, the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at NC State, the National Wild Turkey Federation, the North Carolina State chapter of the National Wild Turkey Federation, and a whole slew of private landowners. And the reason I say a whole slew is we have 3 study areas, one in the coast, one in Piedmont, one in the mountains. And we have a lot of field staff that are working with a lot of private landowners and the university staff to pull this project off. Right now, they're trapping turkeys, putting radio transmitters out in all 3 areas. And certainly this is a long-term project to look at the ecology of turkeys in North Carolina. It's the first time we've done a large turkey study in many years. And just to make the point about how collaborative our efforts are, I put together a list of collaborators, university collaborators that we either currently are working with or we have worked with very recently. And I'm not going to go all the way down through all this and read all this stuff, but I think some of the points that jump off of here is, you know, you not only have University of North Carolina, University of North Carolina schools, but you have pretty much all the state universities in North Carolina, a lot of the private universities, and universities outside of the state that range all the way from Virginia to Georgia to probably the furthest is Idaho. So we do a lot of different types of projects, and this spans the fisheries world and the wildlife world with a lot of different universities to try to get to the types of research objectives that we're really looking for. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that there had been a lot of questions, some of which we've tried to answer, but a lot of questions about what is this research director position and the research committee position. So I've included a little bit of information here. The research director position was created in March of 2019, basically 2 years ago, to serve as the senior technical advisor on all research and scientific processes for the agency. And all this includes coordinating and providing guidance across all the agency's wildlife and conservation research fields, and looking at the scientific integrity and consensus for research conducted by, for, and in concert with the agency. So, and again, I'm not going to read all of this. I just want to point out a couple of main areas. The duties of the position really fall into 5 areas. One is strategic project planning. One is priority and resource planning. One is quality analysis. One is coordination and collaboration. And one is essential communication. So my point is that this position was created to be a value added position. And I've said this every time I've sat in on a division meeting or a program meeting within a division. The goal here and the reason that this position was created and the reason it was put in the director's office is to provide some agency level oversight and coordination with outside entities and value added resources in terms of planning and prioritization. And so I will also say what I've always said in those meetings. If you're engaged in any of these activities and I can be of any assistance to you, all you got to do is ask. One of the things that we're doing, obviously, you know this because you're sitting here, is to try to increase communication, where we started this science communication webinar series. And the series is entitled Understanding Our Wildlife. And just so that everybody knows, because I've been asked this like 100 times, the spelling of wildlife is very intentional. But Wildlife Commission Science Informing Conservation, and I just used a previous webinar that was done by Carrick, and the title of it was A Balance of Craft and Best Available Science, Important Considerations for Survey Research. These webinars are done once a month. They're on the second Tuesday of every month at 11 a.m. Everybody should have gotten an email recently from Director Ingram. And you'll always get a Teams invitation for this. I try to send them out about 2 weeks ahead of time, but you'll always get a Teams invitation for this. And you certainly, as has been the case with this one today and a number of others, if there are other people outside the agency that you think are interested, you can always send that. The other aspect of these webinars is once we're done, as I said in the beginning, they are recorded and they are posted on our YouTube channel. We're working on making them more accessible through our website. But once they go up on the YouTube channel, I send out an email to everybody about their availability. So the other thing, and I'm going to be wrapping up here with this, the other thing is the Wildlife Commission Research Committee. The research committee was created as part of the research director position responsibilities. And I'll say up front, this does not replace any committee that exists within an individual division. So if a division has, you know, a research committee already or a planning committee already or whatever, that's up to that division to determine whether or not that committee continues to operate. This committee is really at the agency level, and our charge is to optimize the commission's research endeavors, to develop adaptive protocols for conducting biological and social research related to aquatic and terrestrial wildlife in their habitats, and provide annual recommendations for prioritizing the use of agency assets for conducting research, and to evaluate topics, you know, that we get requested by either the directorate, the commission staff, or partners. So basically, you know, all the way from, you know, from our field staff up to our commissioners. The committee is chaired by me, by the research director, and reports to the chief deputy director. We have staff engaged in research related activities designated by the divisions and the section chiefs. And I'll tell you, we have one representative at least from every division and office in the agency. And I can let you know who those are if you don't already, but if you have an interest in that, certainly talk to your division chief or your supervisor. We work collaboratively with commission staff and partners to assess research priorities and protocols, and we meet quarterly or otherwise as we need to. And right now we're working very hard to finalize a prioritization matrix for use in determining research project priorities to include, but not limited to, funding issues. And with that, I'm going to wrap up with one of my favorite sayings. This is going to be the second person I mentioned, but the saying is, "Without nature, man has nothing." It's a quote from Herb Stoddard Jr. from 1969. And I'll say again, if you don't know who Herb Stoddard is, go look him up. Lots of really cool history there, especially Southeast history. So with that, I am going to back out of here, I think, and I'll go back to the original. If you have questions, if you would put them in the chat. I'm not seeing any so far, but I know, let's see, we've got 92 people logged in. I know y'all aren't going to let me off that easy. But if you do, I'm going to take it. Any questions? Or anything anybody wants to add for that matter?
David, it looks like there's a question from Lawrence Dorsey that's on the Teams chat. I don't know why it's not showing up. He's asking, where do you see citizen science integrating into our agency research?
And it looks like I just was able, somehow I clicked on a button and that popped up. Thanks, Cindy, for pointing that out. And thanks, Lawrence, for the question. You know, I think citizen science has a lot of aspects and can fit in a lot of ways in our agency. And I'll just give you a couple that popped to my mind. One is in some of the and you know, Cindy's the one that pointed out in the question, but some of the wildlife action plan work, I think has an opportunity for citizen science incorporating into our agency. There's also a new project, which is the North Carolina Bird Atlas project, which is going to incorporate citizen science in that project as well. In a nutshell, I guess I'd say from my perspective, I think those opportunities are in areas where we have a very large need for a whole lot of people, eyes or hands or both, across the state, and we can figure out how to incorporate those people into our activities. I will point out that one of Chris's new responsibilities, as I understand it, is coordinating the citizen science, and it's really good that he's on our research committee. So I really see the research committee as incorporating the biological science, the social science, and the citizen science as well. Let's see here. I think I'm seeing some other. How does the committee or you handle proposals for research coming from outside the agency? So I'm going to hit that question from two different perspectives. One is if there's a proposal from outside the agency and anybody on the committee is asked to review it, certainly we would do that. If a proposal from outside the agency falls in the realm of needing to be prioritized in terms of topic or funding, then we would use the prioritization matrix once it's finished and we're very close. And also, of course, engage whatever the appropriate division is. You know, the committee does not have a budget, which is the way it should be, by the way. So any of those proposals from outside the agency would be funded if they're implemented through one of the division budgets. So whoever the chief or the office director or wherever it's at, whoever that person is would be integral to that conversation. And the first question I always ask is, you know, if it's something coming through the fish division, just to be blunt, I always look at Christian and say, hey man, is this a priority for you guys? So there's a lot of different considerations, but that's sort of the general gist of how I would do it. Oh man. Well, I guess I have to answer all these, don't I? If you had unlimited funding, what would be your top research opportunity for the future? If I had unlimited funding, and again, I'm speaking for David here, okay? If I had unlimited funding, I would take the Wildlife Action Plan and I would look at each section of the Wildlife Action Plan and I would take the highest priority research data knowledge gap that's identified in the action plan, and I would implement projects to address those. All right. Let's see. So Brad Howard, was that a question or a statement?
That was a statement.
And just so, well, I guess y'all can see it, but Brad Howard suggests predators. And I don't think I see any more questions. Yeah, I would love to do some predator work, but that's another discussion. Let's see. Carrick. Yeah, I don't see any more questions. If y'all are seeing it and I'm not, let me know. Anybody have any more? I always try to be respectful of everybody's time, but we do still have a few more minutes. I intentionally didn't want to go past 45 minutes with the presentation. All right, well, if nobody has any more, I guess I'm going to call it then. I'll close just by thanking everybody again for being here. It will be posted. Hold on. Yep, we do have a question. What's the ETA of the matrix? So where we are with the prioritization matrix is we have identified the evaluation criteria, we being the committee members. Well, let me say all this is in draft because
What
the
they,
division,
He's gonna be here at 12 instead of 1. I got
the divisions haven't reviewed it yet. Again, we have identified the evaluation criteria. We have assigned weights to it. We ask each of the 5 divisions that have field research going on to give us a proposal to grind through it. We've gotten all of those and they have been sent to the committee members. We're working on getting our individual committee member scores back to Chris Bova. Chris Bova is taking the lead on this project. Once we do that, we're going to use that process to evaluate whether we think the matrix is in good shape. And once we get it where the committee says, yeah, we think this is good, we're going to send it to the division chiefs and the executive staff and ask them to have either their staff or them or however they want to handle it to evaluate it and get us comments back. At this point, I'm hoping if we have that done by, the end of April or so, we'll be doing pretty good. Let's see. That's the last question I see. Any more? All right. Well, again, thank y'all for being here. Thanks for chiming in. I appreciate the opportunity. If there's anything I or anybody else can do for you, please let us know. And I'll send out an email to everybody once this thing is posted on YouTube. Everybody have a good day. Stay safe.